And we're going to have a CHFA, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, overview of housing trends in Connecticut and associated programs. So I believe online we have, let's see, is Rob McKellick on?
I am here.
Okay, very good. And who do you have with you?
I have right now Andrew Bolger and Vin Bergen, and we have one other attendee. I don't know if he has been promoted.
We got it now.
Marcus Smith.
Okay, very good. You have the floor.
Great. Well, I appreciate you all inviting us here this evening. Perhaps just to begin with, I'll introduce myself. I'm Rob Michalek, Director of Government Relations for CHFA. And I'll let my colleagues who are joining us as well introduce themselves just briefly before we get into this presentation.
Sure, I'm Andrew Bolger, Senior Research and Data Analyst with CHFA.
And I'm Vin Bergen, Senior Business Development Officer.
And I'm Marcus Smith, Director of Research, Marketing, and Outreach.
Great, and thanks again for having us. We have about a 25 slide deck that we're just going to kind of take you through very quickly. Gives you a bit of a primer on who we are at CHFA, a little bit about some of the prominent programs that we run, and then take you through a little bit to some of the housing trends that we are seeing here in the state, kind of what the current situation is and how it compares to years previous. So just to begin with, a little bit about us at CHFA. We have been around since 1969, and we are Connecticut State Housing Finance Agency. Each state in the country has at least one HFA. I think California has two. New York may have a couple as well. And basically the role of HFAs are to deliver financing to meet the affordable housing needs of low and moderate income households. And we do that at CHFA in a couple different ways. We finance the development of affordable multifamily rental housing, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through this presentation. And we also help people purchase homes. And what's worth noting is that we are not a state agency. We're a quasi-public agency. And so though we are set up in state statute and we have a public mission, you won't find us, we're not part of the executive branch of the agency. Mind you, we work very closely with the Department of Housing, which is a state agency, and the Commissioner of Housing is actually chair of our board, but we're not part of the executive branch of the state. And we are set up to be we're a self-sustaining agency, so that we're not in the state budget. We do run a couple of bond-funded programs on behalf of the Department of Housing in the state, but we don't get state appropriations. We're self-sustaining. Next slide, please. So I mentioned one of kind of the areas we focus on is helping families achieve home ownership. And we provide a number of resources for residents to become homeowners. For one thing, we offer home mortgage loans at below market interest rates. I think typically our products differ anywhere from maybe a quarter to a third of a point less than what you'd find on the prevailing market. We also offer down payment and closing cost assistance to first-time home buyers. I'll talk a little bit later on about a particular program, Time to Own, that we offer that kind of fits within this rubric. And then we offer home buyer education classes. We sponsor and fund HUD-sponsored housing counseling agencies that will help folks with financial fitness, with what they need to do before closing on a home and what they need to do once they purchase a home. And though we don't receive state appropriated resources, we do utilize some federal funding mechanisms and have the ability to issue tax-exempt bonds. And so for that reason, there are certain restrictions to what we offer. And typically our programs are restricted to first-time home buyers, which for our purposes, the definition is that somebody who hasn't owned a home in the last 3 years. There also are limits on the income levels of folks that we assist. Generally, levels are not to exceed 120% of area median income or so. And then there are also certain home price limits that are placed on the assistance that we'll provide. So we're not going to fund and subsidize people to purchase mansions and the like. And just to kind of give you an idea, what that might mean in Old Saybrook is, the income limits typically range from about $145,000 for a family of one or two, or up to $167,000 for a family of three or more. And the housing price limit in Old Saybrook is at $510,000, which may not be super high, but it is what it is in your community. Next slide, please. And then kind of the other side of the shop is that we pursue the creation, acquisition, or preservation of multifamily rental units. We do that in a number of ways. We assist developers as they seek to create new affordable units. We help developers acquire and convert non-affordable units into affordable units. And we assist in the preservation of existing affordable units. And there are a number of programs that we do that help facilitate that. I think Marcus is going to talk a little bit about the low-income housing tax credit program, federal program. There's a state tax credit program, the housing tax credit contribution program. Build for CT is another program that Vin is going to talk about a little later on. So there's a whole host of programs that we utilize to assist in the creation of multifamily affordable rental housing. And again, because we are using certain, we're using federally tax exempt bonds and the like, there are some limitations to who we assist in these projects. There are a certain number of units that are reserved for income qualified tenants. And to kind of give you an example, typically we're talking about restrictions in the 50 to 80% area median income band. And again, for Old Saybrook, for a family of four, 50% AMI would be $72,700, whereas 80% AMI would be about $98,000 or so. Next slide, please. And then to kind of give you an idea what that might mean in terms of what careers pertain to those income levels. Again, 50% AMI for family of one is around 51,000, family of four up to about 73,000, 80% AMI, 68,500 for a family of one up to 97,900 for a family of four. And you're talking about occupations such as bus drivers, dental assistants, travel agents, firefighters, police officers, and such. So, working class individuals. And then just briefly to kind of highlight, as I talked a little bit about, our home buyer programs and how we assist folks in purchasing their first homes. There's one very prominent program that's been getting a lot of press lately, and one that we're quite proud of. It's our Time to Own Down Payment Assistance Program, which is basically for first-time home buyers who have lived in Connecticut for at least 3 years and who qualify and receive CHFA home mortgage. And the program is essentially a 0% interest loan with no monthly payments that's fully forgivable after 10 years. So the loan forgives 10% a year. After 10 years, if you stay in the home, you don't have to pay back the loan at all. And it's assistance that can be used to cover up 20% down payment and 5% closing costs. You'll see some figures here. The average assistance amount, it may be a little bit misleading because it used to be that you could get up to a $50,000 time to own loan, but because of how much in demand the program is and the scarcity of resources that we in the state have, that amount has been reduced to $25,000, but still a fairly robust subsidy that we provide to first-time home buyers. And then the chart in the bottom kind of gives you an idea of why we're particularly proud about the program. The column to the left, essentially, or the middle column, is essentially our time to own borrowers. To the right of that is non-time to own borrowers, the folks who get our mortgage loans but don't have a time to own component to it. And essentially what you see here is that we're allowing borrowers who have slightly less income purchase a home that is slightly more expensive and to have a median monthly payment that is less than they would otherwise have. So again, it's a very robust program that we're quite proud of, and just wanted to highlight that for all of you, since it's a program that folks often hear quite a bit about and we're asked about quite frequently. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Andrew, who's going to kind of take us through some housing market trend data and the like.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the housing needs trends we're seeing in Old Saybrook and then the River Cog region more generally. Most, if not all, of the data I'm pulling from here comes from our now 1-year-old plus housing needs assessment, or H&A for short. What the H&A is essentially a all-encompassing data-driven report that dives into the key housing trends we're seeing statewide and regionally as well. It's intended to serve as a resource for both us, CHFA, and also our partners to inform our work and make data-driven decisions. It's split into 4 sections, a couple of which we'll get into tonight. Demographics and housing stock looks at what's called the housing gap analysis, looks at trends coming out of the pandemic, and then just looks generally at different types of markets. It incorporates data from HUD, the US Census, apartments.com, Zillow, and several other sources. And then there's a link there at the bottom where you can find the actual report and also a recently published live and interactive dashboard that has that I update on a monthly basis. So to begin, we can't talk about, housing units and the need for them without talking about first the people that actually live in them, right? So kind of the narrative Connecticut generally been telling itself over the last 10 to 15 years is we're not growing, so therefore why would we need to build more units? And what you're looking at here is the percentage change in population and also the number of households from 2017 to 2022. And you look at the blue at the population change, that narrative kind of does hold true in terms of population. We're increasing in some areas, flat in others, decreasing in other areas. But overall, over that 5-year span, we saw a 0.5% increase in population. But what is even more dramatic is the percentage change in the number of households. So the census defines a new household as any time that someone moves into a new housing unit. So the typical example being a recent college or high school graduate gets their first job, gets their first apartment, is currently living with their parents, then moves to the new apartment. That original household of 2 or 3 now becomes 2 households, one of the parents and one of the recent graduate. And so universally, aside from one area in the state, we've seen household growth of upwards of 2%. Statewide, we saw a 3.5% percentage increase in the number of households. That, it's generally a good thing. It's an economic driver. It's what we want to see happen. But issues arise when we're not pairing it with enough new units, especially recently. So what you see here is the building permits data for Connecticut back to 1966, colored by basically the size of the unit that the size of the building that the unit is in, from one unit to 5 or more units. And what you'll note is that we were building, roughly between 10 to 25,000 units in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the 1990s, leading up into the Great Recession, we were hovering around 10,000 units a year or so. And then the Great Recession hits and we really fall off, especially in the 1-unit category in green there, really just kind of cratering in production. And right now we, in 2023, saw roughly 6,000 permits when, again, pre-recession, we were seeing upwards of 10,000 a year. So really dramatic dip in overall permitting numbers. And then this is where we get into what's called the housing gap analysis, looking at kind of the mix match of households and what's out there for rent or for sale. Basically, the methodology here was developed by the American Planning Association for estimating housing need. The goal of the gap analysis is to estimate the number of additional units by tenure, so whether they're renters or owners, by income level and geography that are basically needed for the number of households to match the number of available inventory in a respective income bracket and geography. It uses data from HUD called the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy, CHAZ for short. Basically custom American Community Survey estimates, and it's used by HUD and others to distribute grants, demonstrate housing need and plan and all things like that. It is not a production target, but it does point to where additional units might be best served. And you can see the formula there is kind of how it works. It takes, again, the number of households in a given area minus the total number of affordable units, taking into account the number of units that are occupied by a different income household. And so when we zoom out statewide as an example, This is kind of visually what it looks like. So you on the left, or for this example, you have the renter gap for 0 to 30 AMI households, so the lowest income renters in the state. On the left, you have the total number of renter households in this income group, shaded by whether or not they are cost burdened, i.e., paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And those are in that dark blue bar there. And then in the light blue, you have the number that are not cost burdened, so paying below that 30% mark. And on the right, you have the total number of units that are, in theory, affordable units that are available to this income group. But those are shaded by in dark green, whether or not they are occupied by someone earning inside this income band, or in this case, whether they are occupied by someone at a higher income level in that light green there. So the gap is calculated both in the kind of dotted line here, basically the difference in the height of the bars, and adding into that the number of units that are occupied by higher income households. Statewide, we found that this gap right around 91,000 units. That resembles some other research from national organizations, but again, that's not a production target, but does point to a significant need amongst this income group. When we zoom out to your region, for the River Cog region, this resembles pretty closely the trends at the state level. So from left to right, again, you have 0 to 30 AMI renters, then 31 to 50, 51 to 80, and 80% and above. So again, you see that kind of outright shortage of units that are available to the lowest income renters. But all the way on the right-hand side, you also see that there are, in fact, more 80% and above AMI households than there are units available to them. So there's kind of a shortage on the kind of poles of the market that then leads folks on the lower end to basically rent up and folks on the higher end to rent down. One, because there's not enough units priced in that income band, but also not everybody wants to automatically max out their housing budget every month. And so while you're in the middle two bars, two groups, you see there are in fact more units available to renters earning 31 to 80% AMI, but there's still pressure there because of basically the squeezing effect from both ends of the market. In the River Cog region, we found a gap. There's a gap of roughly, for the 0 to 30 AMI renters, roughly 3,400 units. Again, not a production target, but does point to a potential need there for additional units. Switching gears a little bit, we're going to talk about some more recent trends to come out of the pandemic, specifically around kind of sales, inventory, and rental trends as well. So this is looking at 1 to 4 unit home sales in specifically the town of Old Saybrook. And once you kind of notice here, it's back in 2002, you'll notice that kind of the run-up to the Great Recession, peaking in kind of 2004, bottoming out in overall home sale activity in those green bars in roughly 2009. This pretty much closely resembles statewide trends. And then we see kind of a gradual increase in overall sales volume leading up to 2021. Statewide, there were roughly 61,000 home sales we recorded that year. That was the most since 2005. In Old Saybrook specifically, there was roughly 270, and as you can 270 home sales, and you can see that's the most we've had on record, according to our database. And while you see overall sales volume come down, specifically with challenges around inventory, I'll get into that in a second, but also as the Fed has increased interest rates, making things more competitive and generally slowing things down, you see volume start to taper off in 2022, 2023, and this year so far. But what we're not seeing is any kind of correction in the median sales price. In Old Saybrook specifically, we have this year to date, median sales price of right around $625,000. Again, this increase is not unique to Old Saybrook. We're seeing this statewide as well. And again, that's really in part just due to a lack of for sale inventory in Middlesex County specifically, but again, statewide. So looking at, or this estimate comes from Realtor.com. It's basically kind of a snapshot at what you might expect to see in a given month if you went on to Realtor.com and just kind of looked around. And so pre-pandemic, Middlesex County would average about 1,000 active listings per month. There's some seasonality to that in the spring, summer, and then versus the fall months. But starting right around the beginning of the pandemic, March of 2020, we didn't see that kind of same seasonal increase into the spring and summer months. And then inventory has continued to drop thereafter. So right now, in Middlesex County specifically, there's about a 77% inventory deficit relative to this time in 2019. We're looking at about 250 active listings compared to in October of this year, compared to October of 2019, where there was up over 1,000 listings. So with that kind of supply constraint, right, that gives home sellers a lot more kind of market power, bargaining power in the transaction. And we've seen prices tick up pretty significantly. So this is the percent of homes that end up selling above what they're listed for from Zillow. So again, pre-pandemic, this number would hover around 20% on average, depending on the month. And then as that inventory started to contract with high demand and household formation happening, we saw this number in Connecticut and then the Hartford MSA, of which Old Saybrook is part of, tick up to 60, 70, and approaching 80% in mid-2022. You see that the United States, the US line, that lighter blue has come back down. We've seen national inventory numbers start to get a little bit better, but Connecticut has remained pretty significantly low relative to where we were pre-pandemic. With that supply constraint also as well, we're seeing homes just sell much faster than they would this time in pre-pandemic in 2019. For the Hartford MSA specifically, the average days on market was just 19 in October. In 2019, this time, that was roughly 57 days. So going from roughly 2 months to 2 weeks on average, 2 to 3 weeks. And then just looking at the rental side, because these markets don't really happen in a vacuum, right? What the conditions renters are facing now are what are going to be the future homeowners, right? And so potentially due to the hot single-family market, we saw rental vacancy rates drop dramatically over the course of the pandemic in both the Hartford MSA and statewide, bottoming out really a little north of 2%. We've rebounded a little bit since, but right now statewide, we're seeing rental vacancy rates right around 3.2%, and that's well below the kind of the 5% levels we were seeing again pre-pandemic. And as you might expect, similar to the limited inventory situation for home buyers and sellers, this gives landlords a bit more bargaining power in the market. And so we saw rent numbers start to tick up pretty dramatically over the course of the pandemic. So looking at here, it's just the year-over-year rent growth numbers by metro area in Connecticut. Again, Old Saybrook being in the Hartford MSA. We saw generally upwards of 5-6% year-over-year numbers in most metro areas. The Norwich market led the pack at 12% year-over-year in mid-2022. But you see these numbers kind of have sort of started to come back down to earth a little bit. Depending on what you're looking at, we're looking at 4-3% year-over-year numbers. But that said, that this is just the rate at which rents are increasing. So we've seen average rent increases of statewide of 18%, up from about $1,500 on average to roughly $1,800 in Middlesex County specifically. It's gone from roughly $1,300 on average in 2019 to again upwards of $1,800 on average. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marcus to talk about what we're doing on specifically the low-income housing tax credit. It's kind of our major program for the production of rental housing in the state.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for that incredibly gloomy housing analysis.
Yeah, hopefully I didn't depress everybody, but I handed off to Marcus and Vin to cheer everybody up.
Yeah, so in the face of all of that, there are some resources that CHFA offers. I know both Rob and Andrew mentioned the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, or LIHTC, it's commonly called. I just wanted to give a couple of examples of developments that we've recently funded in nearby towns, just to give you a flavor for what nearby towns and the communities that look or feel a little bit like Old Saybrook might see in the terms of affordable housing. I think what we've seen so significantly recently is the trend of more and more mixed income housing. That is, we're moving away from strictly 100% affordable housing, that being like housing that's meant for 60, 50, 30% AMI, so folks who are making $60,000 and below, to a bit of a mix, right? So you might have some units that are set aside for people who are coming out of homelessness, right up through to unrestricted market rate units, and a healthy mix in between, to help. In a number of ways, it makes the properties a little bit more attractive to the cities or towns who are approving them, to the communities who are going to be living next door to them, and to funders and the developers. It just makes it a little easier to manage that mix. So what you're seeing here is Parkside Village. I'm sorry, Parkside Village is formerly known Parkside Village is now called Shoreline Grove in Brantford. These are newly redeveloped community. It was a public housing authority development. They transformed it completely. 67 units, 7 of which are market rate, as I mentioned, is a good mix there. And it built to passive house standards, which is another thing that we're seeing more and more recently, is developers aspiring to make their communities more sustainable, especially in the face of climate change and increasing energy costs. The more they can do to provide more sustainable and energy efficient developments, the better, both for the bottom line and for the health and well-being of the residents. Next slide. This next development is Wellington and Madison. Again, another mixed income development. You can see it's slightly different in makeup. These are kind of smaller buildings, kind of built somewhat townhouse or condo style, all within walking distance to public transit and Madison's Arts District and Commercial District, with a grocery store nearby and transportation nearby. So, and 7 of these units were to be set aside for individuals experiencing homelessness. So just a couple of examples of developments that we're seeing. As Rob mentioned, we do have some resources. We have various resources that are available to support multifamily real estate rental development, and which Vin's going to get to in a second. That's going to be more towards the middle income, but these developments are primarily meant for folks who are in that 50 to 60% area median income. But as I mentioned, we are seeing more and more units available for folks at various ends of the spectrum. Happy to answer any specific questions that folks have about the LIHTC, but just to keep things moving, kind of hand it off to Vin.
Great, thank you, Marcus. And to continue on with where we started with the lower income and the lower AMIs, we moved towards a new program initiated by the governor in the biennium budget in 2023. Back then, he had allocated in the budget $800 million towards affordable housing developments and programs, with the Department of Housing leading the way. This is one of those programs where we are facilitating a middle income workforce housing program on behalf of DOH. The governor was hearing a lot from the communities and the employers throughout the state that there wasn't sufficient quality housing to support the growth in the job growth and the job demands. Particular parts of the state, southeastern part and the southwestern part, were probably more seriously impacted, but it really is throughout the state, the need for additional housing. And just dovetailing with what Andrew was saying about the demands and needs, getting more housing built is ultimately the number one goal. At the end of the day, you're going to be building brand new. And yes, that'll be at the higher end of the spectrum, but those developments 10 years from now will not be the A product, they'll be the B product. And you have to continue to build to support the ongoing needs of your population. So the Built for CT program is really unique and first of its kind in the state, where it's a public-private partnership with the banking community and the lending community. And so the program was allocated $200 million to create what essentially is a subordinate loan or a mezzanine financing piece of debt, in which we will provide a low interest rate loan at an amount equal to $125,000 per middle income unit. Middle income / workforce housing is typically defined as 60% households making between 60% and 120% area median income. What we were seeing over the last few years, due to the increase in interest rates, increase in costs, is that it was making it not feasible. I mean, a lot of developments were on the sidelines that had been penciled out prior to the pandemic, expecting lower interest rates at reduced costs than what they were seeing today. And these developments weren't moving forward. They weren't financially feasible. And they were, in some cases, there were significant gaps in the capital stack that wouldn't allow them to move forward. So the program is really earmarked towards working with shovel-ready projects with the banks, deals that they have or can bring into their pipeline, and then work with those developers to make sure that we have at least 20% of the units be restricted to households making between the 60 and 120% AMI. What's important is that not only, when we determine what AMI is appropriate for a particular development, we have to analyze the market rents in that town and in that area and what those units will get, via the market. And we make sure that we restrict the units at an AMI level, excuse me, that's going to provide a discount of at least 10% to the tenant. And in some cases, as much as 30%. So there's a trade-off. They're going to get money from us at a low interest rate, but the developer's also going to set aside units that are going to be at below market rent. So they're going to give up some revenue. But at the end of the day, it helps meet their needs of getting the deal built, giving them a return that's appropriate for them to move forward. And it also provides for getting those units to the marketplace and then setting aside a portion of those units affordable to people who are in the workforce housing community. It's your police officers, your firemen, your nurses. And so it's gainfully employed people. And it's really been a great success. We started the program, really got our initial funding back in November of last year. It was approved in June. And since then, we've been able to be involved in, I think it's over 1,700 units being developed and restricting over 500 units in the workforce housing. So here is just an example of a few deals not far from Old Saybrook. We have Blue Way Commons, Phase 2 in Haddam. This was comprised of 32 units, of which it was a second phase of a prior development that was 56 units. We looked at the second phase of 32 units. The borrower was looking for a certain amount of funds. We typically, while we look for projects typically 50 units or greater, we will look at projects smaller than that, but we will require a minimum of 10 units be restricted. So in this case, they were restricting approximately a third of the units at 80% AMI, and the senior lender on this deal was Dime Bank. So Dime Bank did the primary loan. We sit behind them. We have a relationship with them as a participating lender in the program, and they will share their underwriting with us. They will share all third-party reports. And so that way we can streamline our approval process. And again, it's a real unique public-private partnership in which we're assisting each other in getting business done for the benefit of the state overall. The next slide. This is another deal in Haddam. Again, many communities are not building large 300-unit developments. It's all a function of what you have for land and availability and what can get done in each community. In this case, this was a new development of 44 units. We restricted, this was actually one of our earlier deals when we didn't have the 10-unit minimum, but in this case, we restricted 9 units at 80% AMI. The senior lender here was NBT Bank, formerly Salisbury Bank and Trust, who NBT acquired a couple of years ago. And then we have Kelson Row and Rocky Hill. In the prior two examples, these developments were 100% market rate approved. So all the units were going to be built as market rate units per the approvals by the town. In this case, Kelson Row was a development that was already under construction when the program came out, and they already had 22 units restricted at 80% AMI by the town, as the town had an affordability plan requiring them to restrict essentially 10% of the units. We gave credit for those 22 units in calculating the loan amount. We typically will max out at 10%. So on a 200-unit project, if a town is requiring 10% be restricted, we will give credit for that 10%. If they're requiring more than that, we won't give credit. We will just count up to 10%, and then we will restrict an additional 10% to meet the minimum 20%. So in this case, we gave them credit for their 22 units. We added 22 units at 100% AMI because we could see that market rent was high enough in that area for this product that we could still get the discount from market that we were looking for the benefit of the tenant, and yet restricted at 100% area median income. In this case, the senior lender was Liberty Bank. And next slide, please. And the last project that I wanted to share is the Waterford Woods Phase 3. This was third phase of a development in Waterford, in which there was 216 units being proposed for development. The town of Waterford didn't have a formal affordability plan. However, they were interested in having the developer provide some affordable workforce housing units. And so the developer brought the program to the town, explained what it entailed, and they agreed to allow for the Build for CT program to be applied to this development, in which we are going to restrict 44 units at households earning between 60. I think in this case, these were restricted at 80 or 100% AMI. And so it sort of served the needs of both. Senior lender here was Liberty Bank. You know, one thing I want to note is that oftentimes when the towns restrict units, they're going to require restrictions as long as 30 years. And we'll give that credit, obviously. In the instances with this program, the restrictions are only for a minimum of 6 years from final C of O, which may seem like a short period as a minimum requirement. If it is, the other side of it is that it's a minimum of 6 years or as long as the loan is outstanding. And the loan has a 20-year term after it's complete. So they get very favorable terms of financing, a 1 to 3% rate with a 40-year amortization. And so they're really compelled to keep that financing in place just by virtue of the terms of the loan. However, we needed an outlet for those developers who might sell down the road and decide at a certain point they want to get out of the restrictions. We will work with towns, however, that want to use the program as their means to provide affordability, and if necessary, extend our minimum restriction period in conjunction with discussions with the developer, so that everybody is comfortable that what they're getting is satisfactory. And again, we look at the restrictions as being important. Obviously, we're trying to provide this sector of the rental community with some relief, but we're also know that by getting the units built, at the end of the day, is going to further that goal by just having more units, which more supply helps satisfy the demand, helps reduce the rental increases over time, and alleviate that issue. So I think if there's any other, I think that's the end of the presentation. So, you know, feel free. I mean, I think we wanted to give you guys, I know it's a lot to digest, a lot of segments here. You're welcome to, we'll open it up to questions here on any of the segments. Happy to answer what questions you have.
Okay. Question. Vin version touched on it most clearly with the 6-year minimum affordability or the life of the loan, which is 20 years, and possibly extending it beyond that to maintain some affordable units. But in the low income housing tax credit program stuff, I didn't hear anything about terms. When does the clock run out, and what happens then?
Yep. So the IRS, this is an IRS program, so it's a federal program. The IRS requires a minimum of 30 years of affordability. CHFA as a policy will restrict the units for 40 years a minimum. So you'll see those units restricted for that at least that amount of time.
Right. Old Saybrook has 8-30G, which is 40 years. And we also had a different program under the incentive housing zone state statute. And we have 186 units under that, which have a 20-year timetable. We're already 7 years into occupancy. So in 13 years, those 38 affordable units go market rate. And we then lose on the scoreboard of how many affordable units you have. So why is there necessarily a clock to run out? Because I've heard that you have other things where there is no clock. They will always be affordable.
I'm not aware of units that are affordable in perpetuity. Typically, I mean, there might. I think the most I've heard is like if there's a restriction on the land, like a town might say there's a 99-year lease, and then for that amount of time, the units have to be affordable. But which is effectively a long forever, right? But
Well,
um, but I think
if there's an owner that makes them
yeah,
perpetually, yeah.
right, yeah. And I would say for the most part, it occasionally will happen where, you know, affordable units coming through the LIHTC program will reach where the clock runs out, and sometimes those units will just expire and they'll become market rate. For the most part, we see the owners come back to CHFA to get more capital because at that point they probably have some repairs that need to be made, or the use of the project is kind of has outlived its use, so you know it's obsolete. So they might need to completely redevelop the property. So they end up coming back. We're because the tax credit program is not that old. We're kind of just at the early days of those properties coming back for, you know, what we call preservation investment, where we're looking to preserve the affordability of the units and the built environment as well. So I think you'll see a lot of the units, even though the clock seems, you know, relatively short, that the time will kind of be reset.
All right. I have
Yeah,
other.
I'll pose a question, in terms of these different, financing plans. Are there responsibilities or restrictions on the renters or buyers in terms of, let's say, the time that they can be there, or if they get a much better paying job, or if they, you know, I can't anticipate what kinds of restrictions you might have in the terms for a tenant in these buildings.
Yeah, I'll take that. In all the programs, when we talk about affordability to an area median income level, it has to be proven out by the household incomes. And every year they have to present the information to substantiate where their income levels are and that they're in need and that they meet the maximum income levels for that area median income. And if they call it earn out, or they over income, and you learn that, which is a goal, right? I mean, people want to move up. They're not necessarily looking to stay in this housing forever. They're looking to get better jobs and to improve their situation and hopefully own a home eventually. So, you know, there is limits on the household income based on the number of people that live there. And once they exceed that level, they then, depending on the program, they become over income. The landlord now has to replace that unit with a newly restricted unit with a qualifying tenant. We're not kicking people out immediately. We'll give the landlord some time to replace that unit with a newly restricted unit, after which they can then go back to that unit and start increasing their rent towards market based on the income that they are making. So it's not it forever for the tenant. The tenant has to qualify and requalify every year upon renewal, much like any lease.
Yeah, and it's pretty intense, the compliance that's required to manage these properties. And CHFA for its part does deep due diligence in screening the development team, including the property management agency, to make sure that they're experienced and qualified to manage and meet those compliance requirements.
Yeah, with the federal tax credits in particular, those credits are, you know, not to get into the weeds too much, are sold to the private market. Those companies, you know, utility companies, et cetera, will buy those credits to reduce their taxes over a 15-year period. However, those credits are no good if the property is not complying with the restrictions. So there are companies that are monitoring that. This is really the low income, the LIHTC deals that are hired to monitor and maintain the monitoring so that they do comply, and that the benefit of the tax credits, which raised equity to help build the project, is able to be achieved by the investor.
Right, but just to pursue it, if you have a fully rented building and you have certain ones that are under the restriction, and suddenly that person is making more, you know, has got a new job and doesn't have, so the developer doesn't have one that they would give somebody else a discount, or no, actually, they wouldn't have anybody else in the building who's eligible for a lower income, so does that result in a fee being charged to the developer or something? I mean, what would the developer do in that case for that year until somebody moves out or something? I just,
Yeah, it's when leases roll and people move out. There are people that move out. Not all, these are not necessarily 100% affordable developments. As we were saying, there's different income AMIs across these units. So it's not as if it's 100%, 30% low income where nobody moves out. But I think there is at some point, and I can't speak to all the details of the LIHTC deal, there is, a period of time in which you can keep them there temporarily until you then have a replacement tenant to replace that unit. And it seems to work quite well.
Yeah, it's called the next available unit rule in the IRS code. So it certainly does happen from time to time, and there are grace periods, as Vin mentioned, for to account for that.
thank you.
So Paula, in our incentive housing development and some of our other developments, we've had that situation where people, their income no longer meets the qualifications for that. So Old Saybrook, actually, we conducted an audit, and we've gone through all our affordable units, doing random samples to see, how things are working, what the property owners are doing as far as compliance, making sure that their numbers work for the 830Gs and the IHZs, and they're meeting the requirements. And what's happened is that if someone is making more money than what they need to qualify for the unit, as I think it was Marcus just said, they wait for the next unit that becomes available with the same amenities. That unit drops, so if that person who's making a higher level of income than what qualifies wants to stay, they get the increased rent, and the other unit switches to a lower income unit, so you're not displacing
Yeah,
people.
okay.
I think that's what you were trying to,
Thank you.
it's complicated.
It gets complicated, yes.
Bob, you had another question? Bob Friedman?
No, I was, I had a point to make, but it was in terms of all the depictions of the housing that you showed. There was only one that had more than 3 stories, I think. Most of them were 2 stories. Are there any limits in terms of the number of stories for the projects in Connecticut, let's say in Middlesex County in particular?
I don't know of any limitations. It conforms and complies to the building codes of the city, right? So each city has its own requirements, and the developments have to comply and conform to that. I will say that what's noticeable over the last 50 years as we talk about projects, or we talk about them as projects, people envision big, tall brick buildings that were the housing projects of their day growing up, and what they saw. And really the studies have shown it's a much better environment to have the mixed incomes, build homes that are typical of what you would live in regardless of income level, and have that pride of ownership, rentership. And that really carries the day. So people don't feel like they're being placed somewhere. They are living amongst everyone else, and they're all working hard to get to the next level. And I realize that may not be everyone's view all the time, but I think that's really changed the complexion of affordability. You could drive by developments that you would not realize have affordability or low-income housing tax credits, and that's a significant change over decades prior.
Yeah, I mean, if you could juxtapose it to, say, like more market rate developments where it's not unusual for the developer / property manager to come back to refinance, to restructure, recapitalize, right, to reinvest in the property every 5 to 10 years, Vin, right? So, but with low income housing, affordable housing, where the deed restriction or the affordability restrictions are much longer, typically developers are building these properties to last, right? So they're high quality high design standards, high quality materials, highly efficient. So they're built to last with good materials, and we have pretty strong design standards, construction standards to boot. So I think you'll see something that's higher quality for sure than what you might have seen in the past. To Vin's point.
So I think I heard CHFA is interested much more in 50 units plus.
On the Build for CT program, we just because of the amount of funds we're trying to put out, we want to be at least 10 units, which would give me a little over $1 million on a loan. So the goal is to be larger when we can be, but we will consider projects smaller than that. And like we said, usually no smaller than 30 units, but then I require a minimum of 10 units be restricted. So we're still
Right.
giving out $1 million, but this does not apply to the CHFA tax credit LIHTC. This is only under the Build for CT program as we try to be efficient in our deployment of capital and funds.
Yeah,
So
and I'll just add, when it comes to LIHTC, and it's kind of above my pay grade, but I think typically you're talking still about projects that are 30, 40 units plus, just to make them financially feasible and doable. So, so yes, kind of generally speaking, you are talking projects of that size, that if you're either using Build for CT or LIHTC.
So the land availability in Old Saybrook becomes a real big question, because to achieve soils-based density for on-site septic, because we don't have central sewers, in order to have 30 units in a project, there's not a lot of sites where that could go.
Yeah. No, there's obviously impediments. Town water and sewer in some places, particularly in more rural areas, is a challenge for development. And listen, there is the need to address this issue is multi-pronged, and it comes from all angles. We come from one angle, and that's providing financing and trying to create programs to help support and grow the housing stock. But clearly there's needs from all sides, whether it be regulations, whether it be zoning, whether it be just overall openness to development, knowing that it's a need that we have to address. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to get worse.
I saw on your chart with that kind of like housing count here, it seemed like in like the 1990s, like that 2, 3, and 4 unit construction just like vanished off the chart here. Like, are there programs out there that would support that kind of 2, 3, and 4 unit sizes? Or is it really, it's either single family purchasing or it's these larger multifamily projects going in?
Okay, so just to be real specific, but on-site septic requirement is not a showstopper, right?
No, I don't know enough about the not for, if the bank is willing to finance a development, then we're willing to stand behind it in the second position. So it's really about meeting the needs and standards of the town. And if, as long as that capacity is capable of handling the usage, then the development's feasible. When it comes to the LIHTC deals, I cannot speak enough to the requirements and whether septic, and I don't know if Marcus or you guys know specific to that standard. But it is part of, I'm sure it would be addressed in our application process, and certainly something we could answer if there is any restrictions relative to septic, and come back to you on it. So regarding the smaller developments, we do have a CDFI program where we help fund funds to the community development finance institutions and nonprofits, helping particularly in a lot of the cities that provide financing for 2 to 20 units. A lot of times it's revitalization of neighborhoods, helping people just come in and renovate smaller developments, 2 to 20 unit sizes. And while we don't facilitate the program, we provide funds to these CDFIs to help them facilitate financing to those smaller projects in certain areas. I want to say it's more focused on the cities where there's older stock of that type of housing that's been in disrepair. It needs to be renovated and maintained so that it can be brought back to a standard of living and improve the neighborhood dynamics.
So in Old Saybrook, I'm one of the first people to meet developers, and 50 is kind of that magic number. I need 50 plus. And a lot of times the developer, well, if I can't get the 50, then I don't get my tax credit, I can't get my financing. So that there is a little bit of wiggle room to go below the 50. It's not the town saying, no, we don't want different types of housing or the amount of housing. It's really septic systems that are dictating the density, plus we have wetlands and flood zones and all those fun environmental constraints of being on the Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. So I mean, is it safe to say, well, have you gone back and talked to CHFA or whatever agency to go for lower than 50, or am I just wasting their time?
I think it depends on the deal. There's just an economies of scale in which a developer needs to build so many units to make it feasible, financially feasible. The cost of development, the number of units, clearly as they build larger developments, it becomes, the price per unit becomes cheaper. And so that's just a fact of economics, not solely a result of the marketplace. It's just the cost of construction to mobilize the fixed costs and the things that go along with that. So I can't speak to every deal, but I'd say that most developers are looking when they can to build larger, so that they can get, more, get some profit. They're going to get less profit per unit, but they have more units. But each deal is going to be distinct and different. Certainly they can come and speak with us. And I don't know, again, in each instance, it may have different statuses of it.
Yeah,
we
I
do
mean, it
have.
just, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was
go
gonna say,
ahead.
just
Go
if
ahead.
you looked at the, we gave an example of Wellington and Madison, which I think is 30-something units, so it's a LIHTC deal, so clearly it's not dispositive of anything that has to be a certain size, but as Vin kind of alluded to, that there are economies of scale, and typically we are talking kind of larger number of units with projects, but that one I think at 31, if I'm not
31. Yeah. Yeah, I would say I would recommend, Chris, and we can certainly make sure that you're on the mailing list, so you can stay informed. But every fall and spring, we work with the Department of Housing to have what's called the developer engagement process. It's just an opportunity for developers who you might come in contact with to come to the state agencies, state housing agencies, and basically just pitch their idea. Let us know what you're working on. We can talk through what the logistics are, what resources that might be available to support the product, the development. So yeah, again, so I think next one, they just closed the fall session, but the next one should open up sometime in the spring. So we can make sure that you're looped in, so you'll be aware of it when it comes up.
No, thank you. I look at it and I know you said 1,800 or some of the at-rate units. Some of the at-rate units that we have here are 2,800. So it's kind of hard for me to believe. And I mean, and I'm not a developer, but when someone comes in and says, well, I can't make it affordable, but we have developers making 2,800 for at-rate units, how the lower density ones, they're working for some developers, how can it work for all developers?
Yeah, no, it's the costs have gone up, the interest rates have gone up. Again, each deal has its own, you have to look at the development costs and share. It's helpful, I'm sure, if you can get their budgets from them and understand what it's costing them to build, and compare deals by deals and see what the dynamics are.
Well, I mean, a lot of times it's just the initial meeting. I'm looking for 8 acres for 50+ units or X amount, which it's difficult to find with wetlands and so forth. And then you really can't get a density count until you know what the soils are for septic. So a developer come in and say, find me the land, and we're saying, okay, this is great. We need different options for housing, and we're trying to promote that. But then this 50 number and the acreage, and it doesn't work, or I can't get my credits. But I mean, if there's options to go under the 50, it may not end up sending a developer in the fall with a plan. It's more an idea. And it's not that they're developers who haven't done this before. It's why would a developer go through and go through a whole planning process if they don't know what that density potentially is? And if 50 is that kind of magic number, and they say, okay, well, if I can get 20, most likely I'm not going to qualify for a number of these programs. So it's hard for me to direct people who are looking to do something that the town wants with all these questions that I can't answer, and kind of these magic numbers, of 50. I mean, another thing we have an issue with is we'd love to have more units come in that are, most of our affordable units, we have a few 60s, most of them are 80s. So I mean, unless it's a whole partnership or someone else coming in, it's very difficult for us to get units with a lower percentage of the AMI. And that's really what we're looking for, and we're looking for developers to come in and do that. It's just a challenge for us to make it work and find them the land with our land constraints, but also something that'll make it work because of the high numbers.
I understand.
Other questions or comments? Anybody?
I guess are there other towns that you've worked with that have had similar constraints to ours, like the septic only or some of that have been successful? Like what's worked in other places, or are we really that unique?
Well, I think I don't know enough about every town, in the state about, we have, and I don't know if these deal, Groton, New London, I don't know if any of those are in the same boat. Again, when you get into septic in more rural areas, it becomes more challenging not having water and sewer. I think that's just a fundamental challenge for any town that doesn't have that.
And we have water, it's sewer. I mean, we were able, to successfully get to 186 units at the end of North Main Street. The soils were there, the conditions were good for that development. There's other areas that there's land, but you're not gonna get 186 units. You may not get 50, but 30 or 40 would work and help us to tackle the need.
Sure. Like I said, under Build for CT, we will dip down. We're open to those discussions. And I think you just have to bring the deals to the table and have those discussions and encourage them to come speak with us.
And I would think too, Rob, you might be more looped into this, but I think it was talked about quite a bit in last year's legislative session. It certainly is on the radar of the congressional or legislative leadership in terms of addressing some of these infrastructure issues. So departments like OPM, they're certainly all over it. And I think it's not anytime soon, right? It might be like however long it takes to get the infrastructure in, and then we engage with CHFA. But it's certainly on people's radar.
Anybody else?
I just had a question. I don't know if any of these programs have focused at all about accessibility. I mean, we've got kind of an aging community, some of the workforce, housing. I'm assuming, we'd be looking at folks with disabilities. Is there anything that's been, any of those programs focus on that?
Aging population, we will consider under Bill for CT. We'll look at 55 and older developments. Again, we're just looking at market rate units. If it's a rental development, obviously, those income levels oftentimes work very well for these programs because the income's satisfied, the income of the households are there. And obviously, when you look at the tax credit deals at the AMI levels, it could steer itself towards an aging community or an aging population with lower incomes. Again, these needs are not just meant for a younger person or a younger family making 30% AMI or 50% AMI. It also addresses seniors that can live in those developments as well.
And I would say most developments are, if not handicap accessible, they're adaptable, right? So if the units are easily adaptable to make sure that they're accessible. Maybe not all of them, but there's consideration as part of the design. So I'm not intimately familiar with our design standards enough to know what the requirements are on that.
And it's another resource is Department of Housing. When you have developments that have special needs people that you're looking to allocate a portion of the units, again, it's best to reach out. CHFA and DOH work together, so sometimes there's programs or funds available that DOH can allocate towards certain services and needs at their discretion.
Anybody else? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you, gentlemen. This has been very informative. We appreciate your time and